Pliny to Cornelius Tacitus, letter 6.20. So the letter which you asked me to write on my uncle's death has made you eager to hear about the terrors and hazards I had to face when left at Misenum, for I broke off at the beginning of this part of my story. Though my mind shrinks from remembering, I will begin. After my uncle's departure, I spent the rest of the day with my books, as this was my reason for staying behind. Then I took a bath, dined, and then dozed fitfully for a while. For several days past there had been earth tremors, which were not particularly alarming, because they are frequent in Campania. But that night the shocks were so violent that everything felt as if it were not only shaken, but overturned. My mother hurried into my room and found me already getting up to wake her if she were still asleep. We sat down in the forecourt of the house, between the buildings and the sea close by. I don't know whether I should call this courage or folly on my part. I was only 17 at the time. But I called for a volume of Livy and went on reading as if I had nothing else to do. I even went on with the extracts I had been making. Up came a friend of my uncle's who had just come from Spain to join him. When he saw us sitting there and me actually reading, he scolded us both, me for my foolhardiness and my mother for allowing it. Nevertheless, I remained absorbed in my book. By now it was dawn, but the light was still dim and faint. The buildings round us were already tottering, and the open space we were in was too small for us not to be in real and imminent danger if the house collapsed. This finally decided us to leave the town. We were followed by a panic-stricken mob of people wanting to act on someone else's decision in preference to their own, a point in which fear looks like prudence, who hurried us on our way by pressing hard behind in a dense crowd. Once beyond the buildings we stopped, and there we had some extraordinary experiences which thoroughly alarmed us. The carriages we had ordered to be brought out began to run in different directions, though the ground was quite level, and would not remain stationary even when wedged with stones. We also saw the sea sucked away, and apparently forced back by the earthquake. At any rate, it receded from the shore, so that quantities of sea creatures were left stranded on dry sand. On the landward side, a fearful black cloud was rent by forked and quivering bursts of flame, and parted to reveal great tongues of fire, like flashes of lightning magnified in size. At this point, my uncle's friend from Spain spoke up still more urgently. If your uncle is still alive, he will want you both to be saved. If he is dead, he would want you to survive him. Why put off your escape? We replied that we would not think of considering our own safety as long as we were uncertain of his. Without waiting any longer, our friend rushed off and hurried out of danger as fast as he could. Soon afterwards the cloud sank down to earth and covered the sea. It had already blotted out Capri and hidden the promontory of Misenum from sight. Then my mother implored, entreated, and commanded me to escape the best I could. A young man might escape, whereas she was old and slow and could die in peace, as long as she had not been the cause of my death too. I refused to save myself without her, and grasping her hand, forced her to quicken her pace. She gave in reluctantly, blaming herself for delaying me. Ashes were already falling, not as yet very thickly. I looked round. A dense black cloud was coming up behind us, spreading over the earth like a flood. "Let us leave the road while we can still see," I said, "or we shall be knocked down and trampled underfoot in the dark by the crowd behind." We had scarcely sat down to rest when darkness fell. Not the dark of a moonless or cloudy night, but as if the lamp had been put out in a closed room. You could hear the shrieks of women, the wailing of infants, and the shouting of men. Some were calling their parents, others their children or their wives, trying to recognize them by their voices. People bewailed their own fate or that of their relatives, and there were some who prayed for death in the terror of dying. Many besought the aid of the gods, but still more imagined there were no gods left, and that the universe was plunged into eternal darkness for evermore. There were people, too, who added to the real perils by inventing fictitious dangers. Some reported that part of Misenum had collapsed, or another part was on fire, and though their tales were false, they found others to believe them. A gleam of light returned, but we took this to be the warning of the approaching flames rather than daylight. However, the flames remained some distance off. Then darkness came on once more, and ashes began to fall again, this time in heavy showers. We rose from time to time and shook them off, otherwise we should have been buried and crushed beneath their weight. I could boast that not a groan or cry of fear escaped me in these perils, had I not derived some poor consolation in my mortal lot from the belief that the whole world was dying with me and I with it. At last the darkness thinned, and dispersed into smoke or cloud. Then there was genuine daylight, and the sun actually shone out, but yellowish, as it is during an eclipse. We were terrified to see everything changed, buried deep in ashes like snowdrifts. We returned to Misenum, where we attended to our physical needs as best we could, then spent an anxious night alternating between hope and fear. Fear predominated, for the earthquakes went on, and several hysterical individuals made their own and other people's calamities seem ludicrous in comparison with their frightful predictions. But even then, in spite of the dangers we had been through, and were still expecting, my mother and I had still no intention of leaving until we had news of my uncle. Of course, these details are not important enough for history, and you will read them without any idea of recording them, if they seem scarcely worth putting in a letter. You have only yourself to blame for asking them.